let me cut to the chase here, because I'm a happy bunny today and I want to talk around this subject somewhat. But let me cut to the chase and say that I am really, really delighted with the decision that British Triathlon has taken. They've unveiled this policy today, and they are rationalising their categories, obviously with a view to trans athletes, intersex athletes, etc. And they are rationalising their categories and giving us this open and female model that I've rattled on plenty of times, and people with a lot more reach, it's nothing to do with me, people with a lot more reach and influence than I have been mooting this idea, but it's not seemed to have gained very much traction until relatively recently. So I want to discuss this. First, let me just read out that I suppose the most germane passage from their press release. Our policy outlines that triathlon is a sport for everyone and that transphobic behaviour will not be tolerated. It confirms that triathlon is a gender-affected sport, and so for competitive events, for athletes over the age of 12, there will be two categories. A female category for those who are of the female sex at birth, and an open category for all individuals, including male, transgender, and those non-binary who are male sex at birth. Okay, so just to make sure that everybody's on the same page here and understanding this, they are going away from the incumbent model of a men's and women's category and going to a model where the women's category, which has always been about biological sex and not gender, will be explicitly called a female category, explicitly for those individuals who are female at birth. And note it says female at birth, not assigned female at birth. So if you are erroneously assigned female at birth, that can take account of that, one presumes, although it doesn't really clarify that in this policy. And then an open category. And the open category supersedes the male category. Let's do away with that men's category stroke male category. We never needed that category, in just the same way as we have an under 18s and we have an over 40s, but we don't have an 18 to 40s because we understand that the age protection is asymmetric. We don't need to protect those in their athletic prime from those who are older than their athletic prime or younger, so we just have an open. For a long time now, I think the first time I mentioned this was actually back in about 2013, 2014. It was nothing to do with anybody being trans or intersex. It was to do with, I think at the time it was a female golfer who was playing in the PGA. And that my point was that, well, that's fine, but we really ought to start reflecting that into the names of our categories. It isn't a men's category. It isn't a men's event. It's actually an open event. And that we should reflect that. We should rationalise these things. And I've took that position all along. And then back in 2019, 3 years ago, I made a sort of long form video as this was sort of cranking up in importance because, of course, the business of first intersex athletes at the 2016 Rio Olympics, getting all three podium places in the women's 800 metres, and then the business of trans women competing in female events that are labelled women's events. All these things started coming to the fore, so I made a sort of long 40-minute structured video with regard to that. So this is a drum that I've been beating on for some time, but I didn't imagine that it was going to work out like this. I think this has fallen into place. It's like different sporting bodies have made a little bit of a foot in the water and a leap, and that's finally what's got us here. It was a few weeks ago now that FINA, the swimming world governing body, had a fresh look at this and did a marvellous job. I think that they told you who the scientists were that they'd involved, told you who the legal eagles that had been involved, told you who the athletes that had been involved. And so the process was one of the most open processes I have seen with regards to this. And they rejigged their criteria and said that anybody who is biologically male and has gone past, I think it's Tanner stage 2 of puberty, which is like, it's about sort of 12 or 13 years old, where your testosterone as a male would start kicking in. If you've not had it suppressed by then you're not eligible to compete in the female category. Unfortunately, they still call the female category the women's category. So we've still got that issue there, and I'll come back to why that's an issue as this video goes on. And they still never went full in on an open category. They're still having a men's category, but what they did say is that, well, in some of our larger events, we may look at running an open category. Now, what they didn't clear up is whether they're going to have an open category and a men's category. And maybe as a result of that, or maybe it's because a lot of journalists talk about this and are quite frankly far too ignorant of the subject to be doing so, is that quite a number of journalists reported on this as if the open category wasn't going to be an open category, that an open category is a category that's only for trans people. You can't know much about sport and how sporting categories are labelled if that's what you think an open category means. But nevertheless, that's how it was reported. But that's not what it meant. It meant a category that anybody can compete in. So they sort of went part of the way. They mooted it as a possibility, but they weren't getting rid of the men's category, and they weren't going to clarify the issue with regards to the women's category actually being a female. Let's be explicit about it. British Triathlon have done both of those things. And in doing so, at a stroke, in my view, they've given us the model that we should have had right from the word go. Now, fine, we never really used to differentiate between the word woman referring to gender and female as referring to sex. So that's that issue doesn't go back decades, of course. And people weren't to know at the time how we were going to use the words 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years later. Of course they weren't. But right from the word go, we should have really understood, probably if it wasn't due to sexism actually, and wanting to maintain an exclusive men's category, not for reasons of performance, but just to give men their own space, we probably would have had an open category all along. And indeed, as time has gone by, many sports have adopted this kind of model already. In sports, there isn't a men's NBA in basketball. It's just an NBA. Anybody can play in that. There's a women's NBA and an NBA, but it's still called the men's NBA. But it's an erroneous name in actual fact. In cricket, I've mentioned this before, my local cricket team that I used to play for, in actual fact, some years after I played, Aaron Brindle, who was an England women's cricketer, she played quite a number of matches for England. She played very regularly for a number of years for my local cricket team, Louth. Now, it's a men's cricket team, but it's not. It's an open cricket team, but we've maintained this sort of false nomenclature of calling these open teams men's teams, largely because the vast majority of people who play in them are men's teams, but we don't do that anywhere else, right? We don't in an age category say, well, nobody, at the World Cup, nobody over the age of 50 ever plays, so let's call it the Under 50s World Cup. We don't do that because it isn't actually the Under 50s World Cup. Even if no over 50s ever play in it, if you were over 50 and you're good enough, you play in it, so we don't make these unnecessary distinctions. And British Triathlon has gone down this line, and it clarifies a lot of these things with these issues that we've got now. If you are a trans man or a trans woman, you can play in this open. If you are a cis male like me, you can play in this open. If you are a biological female who identifies as a woman, yes, if you wish to, you can also compete in the open. And in fact, like I say, many biological females who identify as women, cis women if you like, have done so in sport, because in many sports it gives them an additional opportunity. There are many sports where the female side of the game, the leagues and the divisions and the structures are not as well developed, there are not as many participants, and so if you are at that elite or near elite level, it's a marvellous thing that you can go and compete in lower level men's teams where you can find your level and maybe compete against people who are slightly better than you and have that opportunity to have those extra additional games that just aren't possible within the structure of the women's stroke female divisions. So it's a good thing for everybody there. And then on top of that, you've got this exclusive biological category that fits in with how the Court of Arbitration for Sport has deemed this, that it's not about legal sex, it's not about gender identity. The protections that we offer in sport, in the words of the Court of Arbitration for Sport, is to protect those who do not benefit from the insuperable advantages of male development from those who have it. So that is where the protection is required, and in this case, that is where the protection has been applied. Look, one quick suggestion here, and then I just want to go through a couple of objections that I know will this policy will come across here. First, the suggestion. This policy isn't going to be implemented for some time now. What they're saying is this is very strict. They don't want a men's category and an open category and a female category, or a male and an open and a female, because it could dilute the open. It could also conceivably dilute the male category. You could end up with 4 top male competitors, and 2 of them choose to go in the open, 2 of them choose to go in the male or the men's category. Why you couldn't just run them alongside one another and have the 2 categories anyway, I don't know, but that's what they're saying. I kind of understand that, but notwithstanding that, it should never be an issue to have additional protected categories where they can serve a purpose. And whilst I'm absolutely on board with British Triathlon that having a category just for trans people, and that's the only category that they can compete in, is not the way to go about this, because there aren't enough of them. It's kind of segregating them. Or to have a separate trans women category and a separate trans men category, that would be even worse in many ways. But there is no issue if there is demand for it. Maybe at the larger events that end up getting run, where there are multiple competitors who are trans women or multiple competitors who are trans men, to allow them to effectively co-qualify both for an open category and for a category just for trans women, or an open category and a category for trans men. Just as you might have people of different age groups all running alongside one another, swimming alongside one another, cycling alongside one another, not necessarily in that order, of course, in the triathlon, but doing all those things alongside one another. And then when you get the results in at the end, you can age band them, and they can maybe win their age category as well as competing potentially in an age open category. So that's something to consider if the numbers support it, having those exclusive categories as well, those segregated categories for trans women and trans men, to allow them to compete in them, as well as, of course, guaranteeing them a place in the open category. Just something maybe if British Triathlon, if anybody from them comes across this, to think about. Okay, the 2 counters to this. I'm not convinced, just let me say I'm not convinced by either of them. These are the 2 counters that I would see, one from sort of each side of this discussion. And I'm going to label the 2 sides of this discussion, as I've done before, the pro-inclusion and the pro-fairness. It's a kind of sweeping generalisation that goes along the same lines as the abortion debate in the States with pro-life and pro-choice. And this isn't to say that if you're pro-inclusion you don't care about fairness, and if you're pro-fairness you don't care about inclusion. It's just a useful name to sort of bundle these 2 groups together. I think the counter that I would see from the pro-inclusion side here, having taken part in a lot of engagements on this, and reading between the lines, quite frankly, although this isn't often explicitly stated, is that I think that there are quite a number of trans women particularly who don't just see sport as an opportunity to engage in physical activity and to compete, but also see it as a venue where there can be some kind of gender affirmation. They want the sports category they compete in to affirm their gender. That's something that they would like. I don't think that's the responsibility of sport to do that. Any more than it's the responsibility of sport to affirm your religion or your politics or your age or anything like that, right? That's not the business of sport. It's the business of sport to categorise people where it's relevant, and resolutely not to categorise people where it isn't relevant. And gender is explicitly a category where it isn't relevant. I would say biological sex is a category where explicitly is. But the interesting thing with their objection would be that if you imagine most people on that side, that sort of pro-inclusion side, right, almost to an individual, they are very, very much on board with the idea that we don't just have a gender binary, that as well as men and women, people identify as men, people identify as women as they would see it, there are also people who don't identify as either. We call these people non-binary, and there are different lists that you can see of non-binary identities. I don't want to go into all of that, but I'm happy with that you can be non-binary and not identify as a man or a woman. But here's the problem. Here's the problem here. If you view sport as an avenue to affirm your gender identity, and as such, that's really why you might not state it, but you really want to see the categories be called men's and women's, because it's not just that you want to compete in this particular category alongside biological females, but you want it to be called women's, and so that it's affirming the fact that you're a woman. What does that do for non-binary people? Effectively, you're taking a big dump on non-binary people, because these people that don't identify as men or women, you are forcing them, when it's wholly unnecessary to do so, to identify as either a man or a woman before they can even begin to start considering taking part in competitive sport. And it's so easy to resolve that. This resolves it. This doesn't force any non-binary person anywhere around the world, when you adopt this system, to identify as either a man or as a woman or any specific non-binary gender, because it makes no comment whatsoever on your gender identity. All it's interested in is, are you biological female? Were you biological female at birth? Or nothing? A category for absolutely anybody. It doesn't matter what your politics is. It doesn't matter what your religion is. That's all irrelevant. It doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter what your biological sex is. Other than maybe one caveat, which is the one philosophical weakness, the one hole in this model, I suppose, is trans men, because trans men are biological females who will get a therapeutic use exemption to shoot themselves full of anabolic steroids, effectively, whereas other females competing in that very same category would be banned for years or for life for doing exactly the same thing. I've thought for the last couple of years about that. I can't find any solution to that, because this is, in my view, a wonderful model, but nothing's perfect. This is as close to the best model as we can come up with, but that is the one weakness there. But for non-binary people, if you're on board and you know, the last thing you want to see is anybody misgendered, sticking with a men's and women's category is about the very worst thing that you could ever do, because it guarantees that every non-binary person is going to be misgendered whenever they take part in competitive sport. The other, and this is the last thing that I want to talk about really, and this is an objection from the pro-fairness side, and this is something that I've heard Kathy Devine talk about. She did a study, I believe, where, and I don't know whether when she asserts this she's giving her opinion, she sides with this, or whether she's just reporting what she heard in the study, you know, or whether it's both sort of thing. But she consulted with quite a number, I think, of female athletes, off the record for this study, you know, anonymously, and asked them what they thought about sport and the sporting categories. And one of the things she asked them about was the idea of an open category to run alongside a women's category or a female category. And some of them objected to it on the grounds that it will devalue the women's stroke female category when viewed alongside an open category, that will be seen as a superior category, and that was their objection. It might also be Kathy's objection. I'm not quite sure. Like I say, if she agrees with that argument or whether she's just reporting it. I have to say, I have real problems with this argument. And the reason is because I don't like to deceive people. And the insinuation with this is that we ought to kind of, it's okay for the men's category to really be an open category, but it's important that we deceive people, that people don't realise that, because if they do, it might alter how they judge and how they evaluate that category versus a protected category. So it's almost like, for the sake of women's stroke female sport, we need to sort of mislead people. We need to be a little bit devious and try and manipulate how they might feel about these things. I don't feel comfy with that, quite frankly. I think if you have an open category, you should be honest about it. And if somebody decides, everybody will make their own decision. If somebody decides they see more value in the open category than in the protected category, whether it be age categories, whether it be weight categories, whether it be valuing a heavyweight more than a middleweight boxing match, whether it be valuing an age open category versus a junior or masters category, or whether in this case it be the open versus the female, that is for them to decide. I am sure some people will decide that. But we shouldn't be trying to manipulate how they feel about it by misleading them. Some people will take a different stance. There are a great many people in the United States who are much more interested in college sport, an age-protected category effectively, than they are in what is the age-open sports in the NBA, and the NFL, etc., that those college athletes then move on to. They actually prefer the protected category. Again, that's for them to decide. I don't like the idea of sort of trying to deceive people and being open to the idea of having an open category, but not calling it an open category because we want to influence how people feel about them. I'm not really happy about that. I think people should be free to evaluate categories and place their interest where their interest actually lies on a fair evaluation with that. And with that, the way that we're labelling categories here that British Triathlon has done, I think is the absolute acme, it's the top, it's the apex of the way that you can do it. It's the way that we should have done it all along. We should have done it now for the sake of trans athletes and for athletes with intersex conditions, but also for the sake of biological female athletes competing in sports that have less opportunities, because there are less divisions, there are less leagues, there are less teams, and there is no reason to preclude them from competing with men in the teams that men have traditionally played for, because men don't need those protections. Because as we observe, the whole point of having those protections is asymmetric. It runs in one direction, the same as our age and weight categories have always done so. Okay, wonderful. I hope this is just the first water pouring through the dam, and no little Dutch boys managed to stick their fingers in this dam, and this is now going to start the ball rolling. I never would have imagined it 3 years ago when I outlined that video on that. Some really wonderful people have done work, have made presentations, have been on Twitter. People like John Pike, Sharon Davis, the ex-Olympic British swimmer, have gone online and have been pounding this drum for some time now. It's great to see. It's great that we've got to this point. It's where we should have been right from the start. Okay, that's it. If you are one of my patrons, by the way, I will set this video as pledged. The last two videos I haven't, so put this as a pledge video. Your pledges are going for the last three videos, if you like. Okay, that's it. I will leave a link down below to the British Triathlon decision. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.